Egypt's 1973 crossing of the Suez Canal is often presented as a classic lesson in "don't underestimate your enemy," a lesson the surrounding Arab nations had learned several years prior during the Six-Day War. Since that 1967 blowout when Israel had gained full control of the Sinai, Israel had maintained an attitude of military superiority. Israel had constructed the Bar Lev Line, a massive fortification along the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. It consisted of 33 manned forts, with the side facing the canal being a 70-foot-tall sand embankment. Israeli engineers estimated it would take 12 hours to blast through this, meaning they would always have ample warning of any ground invasion. They had been enjoying air supremacy for years. Because of all this, Israel felt comfortable sending a great number of their soldiers home for the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Half of the 33 forts were left unmanned. On the night of October 5th, an Egyptian double agent warned Israel of an impending invasion. Unfortunately for them, he said the invasion would be coming at 6 p.m. On October 6th at 2 p.m., Egypt began a 20-minute aerial and artillery bombardment of the Bar Lev Line, loosing 10,000 shells on it in the first 60 seconds. When the remaining 600 Israeli defenders lifted their heads, they saw 100,000 Egyptian soldiers approaching them from across the canal. Using rafts and rope ladders, Egyptian tank hunters then crossed the border. Squads of 10 armed with anti-tank missiles pushed a kilometer beyond the line as Egyptian artillery shifted to deeper targets. Egyptian engineers had determined that under non-combat conditions it would require one bulldozer, 60 men, 600 pounds of explosive, and 8 hours to punch one hole through the wall. The ingenious solution ended up being hydraulic mining. Egyptian rafts would cross with high-volume water pumps. 5 pumps combined could clear the same passage in 2 hours. Israel had a system of underwater pipes that should have allowed them to flood the canal with fuel oil and set it on fire, but Egyptian engineers had found and plugged the pipes the night before. Under the cover of smoke, 4,000 Egyptian infantry crossed the canal, including engineers who would dismantle the Israeli defenses and commandos tasked with destroying artillery batteries and command centers. The Egyptian Air Force had also made good use of anti-radiation missiles, taking out a significant portion of Israeli air defenses, but they faced so many losses that future raids were called off. At 2:35 p.m., the Egyptian flag was raised over the eastern bank of the canal. Israeli reinforcements were coming, but had been successfully bottlenecked by advanced Egyptian units. 10 minutes later, the second wave landed, and Egyptian troops began crossing the canal at will. An hour after that, the first Israeli fort surrendered. Egyptian engineers began work on the wall, with the first breach being opened in less than an hour. 5 bridgeheads were quickly established, and 2.5 hours after the initial artillery barrage, Egypt had over 23,000 soldiers on the far side of the canal. As dusk fell, Egyptian paratroopers were inserted deep into the Sinai. By the following morning, Egypt had opened 60 breaches in the line, but only maintained a dozen bridges, constantly moving them from breach to breach to avoid Israeli airstrike. By now, Egypt had 50,000 men and 400 tanks on the far side, so they dug in and waited for the counterattack. So far, they'd lost 238 men and 20 tanks, while destroying 200 Israeli tanks. Israel constructed their own defensive line 30 kilometers behind the canal. For a moment, it appeared that Israel had begun successfully destroying the Egyptian bridges, but they turned out to be decoys. The Israeli counterattack didn't come for 2 days, and they constantly allowed their forces to be baited into ambushes and destroyed. By repelling a division-sized counterattack on October 8th and establishing bridgeheads on the east bank to a depth of around 15 kilometers, the Egyptians had accomplished the objectives of Operation Badr. Believing that Israel would be quickly victorious, the U.S. had pressured the UN to delay ceasefire talks for a couple days. On October 9th, when they learned that Israel had already lost 400 tanks, the U.S. began to get involved. Israel was able to turn the rest of the war around, which we will cover in detail later, but Israel's military response to this invasion was handled so badly, both through incompetence and military commanders disobeying orders, that it became known as the Makdal, or the Blunder. The war lasted 19 days, involving the militaries of Israel, Egypt, and Syria, also expeditionary forces from Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Cuba, and North Korea. The unexpected military losses eventually forced Israel to open diplomacy with its neighbors, leading to the Camp David Accords and eventually the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. People will tell you this is a lesson in not underestimating your enemy, but to me it sounds more like a lesson in talking to your neighbor before shooting at them, but what the fuck do I know?